like to start out by introducing our speaker here. This is Rich Mogul. I don't really think he needs an introduction, but I'll introduce him anyway. Rich has been around forever, and used to, yeah, I'm not saying he's old. Used to be VP at one of the leading analyst firms, and now runs his own firm, Securiosis, and one of the most widely read security blogs on the internet. So,
thanks, Mike. So to start off this morning, I have to admit I've been working on my filmmaking career. And as part of that, I've just put a little piece together to get us started for today. So if you'll just, let me turn the volume up here if you'll bear with me for just a moment. I just, I got to take advantage of having a stage and a captive, semi-captive audience. I may not subject you to this entire list because it runs for close to 7 minutes of just doing all of the data breaches. Now, I'll leave this on the background. Let me turn the volume down a little bit. Hey, my new MacBook Pro has better speakers than my old one. As we go over through this list, now, look, we all work in security. We all know we have a bit of a data breach problem, and we've all probably have been associated with at least one or two of the companies that are on this list if I let this thing crawl the entire time. Just a quick informal survey. Who here has gotten notification letters? Who here has gotten more than one? So, I mean, just in the informal hand surveys within this room, we know we already have a majority. I would say that was something like 60+% of people in this room, maybe 70% of the people in this room who have suffered some sort of a data breach. How many people have actually suffered fraud related to any of these breaches? Yeah, me neither. And that's a little bit of our problem here, is that we have a bit of an issue with our statistics. So if we actually look at the latest breach statistics, and this is the information that's available from attrition.org, as well as the Privacy Rights Clearinghouse, we find that 310 million records, over 310 million records have been lost due to various data breaches. What's the population of the United States? 300 million. So this is pretty much more than one. Now, these stats don't really fully work. Why don't they work? Well, for example, how many people here multiple breaches? Quite a few of us in this room. So that each gets one little checkbox on this particular list. But I think it's reasonably safe to assume that a majority of adults, of people that have credit and other kinds of things within the United States, have suffered some form of a data breach over the past 5 years. Now, the levels of losses that have occurred over this, the fraud levels are increasing, but are still, in most cases, within the acceptable levels within the financial services industry. The problem is that the nature of losses, where those losses are occurring, is shifting over time. In other words, a while ago, when it was just the sort of strict financial sense of us dealing with our banks and having those relationships, it was either we, the consumers, we'd bear certain levels of losses, and the banks would bear levels of losses. What's changed over the past 5 years is you, in business, even if you're not in financial services or retail, can now potentially bear the cost of some of those losses. And this is due to breach notification laws. This is due to a number of other reasons. Now, I'm also not going to sit up here and give you some sort of silly number like $168 this year and $172 next year per lost record that you're going to suffer as a business. I think we can all accept that these are probably not acceptable. And the way that that was a weird way of saying it, except that probably not acceptable. Anyway, the way that I like to think about it is, if you suffer a data breach today and you have to do notification, if you lose 1 million records, let's take a very low, reasonable, conservative number. Let's say it costs you $1 to $2 per record to write a letter, figure out the customer's address, put it in an envelope, lick the stamp, send it out the door. Have your call center to answer the calls when the customers start whinging at you. What's that going to cost? $2 per record, $2 million down the drain. So I don't think we even need to go to these extreme financial models to understand that there are real loss numbers associated with this, to us on the business side, clearly on the fraud side, clearly on the consumer side. At the same time, as much as there's a big problem, it's not to the point where I think society is going to collapse and our financial systems are going to go down. Yes, sir?
What is the distinction then in terms of what kind of record is lost? Because losing a credit card and losing a social security number or a passport number are really two different things.
I will get to that in 3 slides.
Okay, good.
Yeah, that's actually a really important part of this. By the way, we're in a small room. One of the things I really like about this conference is the more intimate atmosphere here. So please interrupt, ask questions, do whatever you want. Challenge me on my assumptions as we go through this. So as this kind of trend all started with data breaches. A lot of how we're going to present this is a series of case studies today. I'm going to walk through a bunch of major breaches. I've picked those breaches specifically to illustrate different kinds of losses and different kind of points as we go through this. And the first one that I ever had experience with was back when I was working as a sysadmin at the University of Colorado. I'm a geek. I bought a lot of stuff online, or at least back then online in the early days of the internet, and I woke up one morning, turned on my laptop, dialed in over my 28.8 modem, waited 30 minutes, and this was in my inbox. This is a letter that Egghead.com, the CEO, sent to all Egghead.com customers, and I was a recipient of this letter. It's the first time I was a victim of a data breach. Well, sort of the victim of a data breach. And basically what Egghead stated was that they had detected an intrusion on December 18th. By the way, what happens a few days later in December? Maybe a week later. Big holiday, I hear? I don't know, I'm a Jewish kid from Jersey. I might be uncertain about this kind of a thing. December 18th, they detected an intrusion. They contacted Kroll & Associates, security company, on the December 21st, and they notified the credit card companies that they believed they had losses of these numbers. They went ahead and then notified 3.7 million customers on December 22nd. Who here shops for anything after December 22nd? Yeah. I know I do most of my shopping around December 24th. Card issuers are literally canceling and reissuing cards during the height of the Christmas shopping season. 20 days later, after the investigation, Egghead believed that they didn't actually lose the credit card numbers. Did that matter? No. Why? Because the banks had already carried all of the losses associated with reissuing those credit card numbers. So they believe that, and part of the reason they believe this is that the credit companies did not report any increased fraud levels on those credit card numbers. That is one very clear way that you can measure this. Maybe 20 days isn't a big enough period. Maybe you wait a year, maybe you waited 2 years. But if that credit card hasn't been used within 2 years for any fraudulent activity, then it's a pretty reasonable assumption that that stuff wasn't lost. And then they filed for bankruptcy on August 15th, and they were acquired by Amazon on November 26th, and not acquired the way, you know, Flickr got acquired or Skype got acquired or any of those companies. They didn't get a whole lot for their particular acquisition. Well, what did we learn out of this? Well, we learned a couple of things out of this particular breach. One of them is pretty much the wrong lesson. Most people thought that Egghead.com went out of business because of this particular breach. It also inspired a generation of secrecy. I know because I was a Gartner analyst fairly quickly after this, and I know when I would go into customers, and I was the data security guy at Gartner, and we would start talking about breaches and such, they'd say, well, we don't want to do a notification because look what happened to Egghead. We don't want to end up going out of business the way Egghead did and losing all of our customers, which is a load of butkus. Because if you actually look at the business metrics for Egghead.com, which I did by looking at the equivalent of the Nielsen ratings, I can't even remember which service I used at the time. If you track that and if you track their business, they were in decline long before this breach. I mean, Egghead.com was tanking out long before this particular breach occurred. Their site visits and all of that was down. Their business metrics were all on a very steady decline, and there was not a sharp spike associated with this particular data breach. So this did not put them out of business. We learned the wrong lesson with Egghead.com. And that's one of the reasons why, if you remember my little data breach, from the little Star Wars thingy from the beginning, the year 2000, we had, what, 5 notifications or something? Year 2001, not a whole lot, and then the numbers increased after that. We'll go into that, and in this audience, you guys probably all know the answer. So where do we go from there? We've had numbers of breaches in the few years that were following Egghead. Some of the more notable ones that I like is Ziff Davis, who Any ZD reporters in the room? Do you still have jobs? They declared Chapter 11, last week, unfortunately. Not going out of business, just restructuring. Anyways, Ziff Davis lost hundreds of credit cards. They actually got in trouble with some regulatory authorities for that. Ford and Experian, this is one of my favorites. So basically, the Ford Motor Credit Company got compromised. What happened is somebody got the username and a password from a dealership to do the credit checks on people who are buying new cars. They then went and did well over 13,000 credit checks on people, which I don't own a car dealership, but if I had 13,000 prospects that got to the point where I could actually legally do the credit check on them, I'd be pretty freaking happy. And no offense, I wouldn't be standing here in front of you. They went ahead and did the credit reports, and what I really like about this one is they sorted them by zip code. Anybody know why? Rich people don't like to live near poor people. And so they sorted by zip codes, and they used that as a quick filter when they were doing their credit checks to pull people's locations to go after the people who had higher credit ratings. That was one of the more interesting ones. After that, there was the TriWest. They lost a bunch of DoD records for 562,000 veterans. Now, there are two groups I'm going to talk about in this presentation that you do not want to piss off. Generally, one of those groups is veterans, people who have been in the military and received level of training, because not only do they tend to actually be fairly politically active, they have very long memories. My father-in-law, his information was lost from this in 2003, and he still complains at least every 6 months about this particular loss because of the fraud reports and the credit monitoring. He's always paranoid about anything. I mean, he still, uses a Windows computer that lets his niece, our niece, play on the internet with, which gets all sorts of garbage on it. But he still blames TriWest and the DoD for that particular loss. And a bunch of others. Up in Canada, that was a funny one. I was in Regina, Canada, which is really freaking cold. You have to literally leave the malls open at night in the winter because that's how you walk around town, because they don't want you walking on the streets because of the cold. And when this went down, basically a contractor for IBM had lost all these records, 180,000 records. They thought it was government officials. Turned out it was a sysadmin who took a whole hard drive home because they thought they were done with it at work. Huge political scandal up there. And a bunch of other breaches. I'm going to save and go into some of the more detail on some more of the interesting ones as we go on. So between 2000 and 2003, we did have some incidents in the news, but this is like almost most of the incidents that were in the news over that time period. And then in 2003, we started realizing we were having a problem, and California did 1386. Is anybody not familiar with 1386 in this room? Yeah, everybody knows what this one is. California Breach Notification Law. One of the interesting things you got to keep in mind about this is it's not if you lose a credit card number or social number. You have to lose first name and first initial, or first name or first initial, in conjunction with last name, in conjunction with the credit card number, social number, bank account number, and if it's like a bank account number, it has to be in conjunction with the password or something used to access that bank account. Still pretty good, and all it says is you got to do a breach notification. Big law, we all know it had a huge impact on our industry, except it was promptly ignored right after it was passed. 1386 was passed, went into effect in July of 2003, and if you actually look at the breach notifications, you find that no, there really weren't that many notifications between 2003 and 2005, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So what a lot of this has come to is what I started off with a little bit, which is that what I kind of call the law of data breaches. And this is so that we can understand how we might have our associated losses with this. And it is that, even if the customers don't suffer from fraud, remember, I had you all raise your hands, and none of us have suffered from fraud in this room. I have never been a victim of any kind of credit card fraud. I've never been a victim of any kind of identity theft, and I have lost both credit cards and my Social Security number in multiple breaches. I know that. Some people have had those particular levels of fraud. But you as a business, if you're one of the ones associated with the loss, particularly if you're the one that's been breached, you're going to suffer no matter what happens to the consumers. And the only reason I have to say this is particularly for the business types in the room. They go, well, we all know a lot of executives think this way, well, maybe we lost this information, but they can't trace it back to us. In some cases you actually can, but most of the time you can't. And so the businesses kind of think, well, the consumers, they're fine. Nobody's ever, nailed my credit card. But because of the changing regulatory environment and the way the notification laws, and I'm not talking about HIPAA, for the healthcare side, because HIPAA actually, we all know that's not enforced. Or Gramm-Leach-Bliley, which is kind of enforced, or SOX, which has nothing to do with this, or even PCI, which is just a way for credit card companies to make sure that you get in trouble if something bad happens and their risk is protected. They don't really actually care that much about making you more secure. So We, though, the businesses who actually are the ones that suffer the breach, are going to suffer those financial losses thanks to notification laws, assuming we comply with the law. And by the way, not everybody does comply with the law. I know of plenty of cases where companies have kept things quiet, hoping that nobody would figure out that there was a breach. And we also have to understand that losses come in two forms: credit card fraud and identity theft. I do not give a rat's ass about credit card fraud as a consumer. Why?
Credit card companies bear all the risk.
Well, credit card companies don't bear any of the risk. The merchant institutions and the issuing banks, but yeah, exactly.
But not you.
I don't bear the risk. That's a secured investment for me when I use a credit card. For a while, I was pissed off at the credit card companies because of how badly I know they gouge people. I was using my debit card. So I'd swipe my ATM card and put my PIN code in. A, it was more secure at that time. Now that not so much. And B, I just didn't want them to get those transaction fees. They charge those merchants, what is it, 3 to 5% on average? They charge the merchants fees to be able to take a credit card transaction. And I stopped doing that once breaches became more prevalent, because with my debit card or my ATM card, I don't have that fraud protection unless I have a special account with my bank. With my credit card, I don't bear those losses. So we're all insured. And as long as you're reasonably cautious and you monitor your credit reports, you as a consumer are going to be safe. It's a pain if you get your card reissued. I had to get a card reissued because it expired, and like all my magazine subscriptions that I had put on auto subscribe, and my all my cell phones and all that other garbage I had that was set to do my auto pays, all of a sudden I had to go update all of that, and it was a real pain in the rear because I just kind of had to wait until they realized I wasn't paying them, and then I had to give them the new number because I didn't even remember all the people that I was paying off every month. Identity theft's a bit different. And identity theft is, while it's not unique in the United States, it's close to unique in the U.S. Because in the U.S. we rely so much on basically a secret number that's not secret to define our entire financial identity without any personal relationship with the financial institutions from which we do business and give us money. It creates a little bit of a problem. And so that problem is because your entire identity, financial identity, can be compromised with loss of that Social Security number. And if that information gets out and with your name and everything else, and we all know how bad that is. That is really bad. Has anybody actually suffered it? I haven't, but usually one person in the room has been a victim when I give this talk. The average cost, last time I was at a conference in Vegas just last month, right before I did my shoulder thing, and the woman in the room, it took her 3 years and a lawyer to get her credit record cleaned up. And she didn't have to pay her lawyer. I can't remember the reasons why. It was either an insurance or it was a family member kind of lawyer thing that did that. I can't remember the exact details, but I mean that would have cost well over $1,000 in legal fees to get it cleaned up. I have identity theft insurance, actually. I'll talk about that later. I use one of the companies out there that does the prevention stuff. And I think they cover AIG does like the first $25,000 of potential losses. And then they're self-insured after that. I mean, that's pretty crazy, those numbers. And I know a person I used to work with at Gartner got nailed. There was another analyst years and years and years ago. I don't even remember who it was. They left the company long before I did. Went to apply for a home mortgage. They said, well, what about this other one you haven't paid off that you're in default on? Somebody taking a mortgage out in their name. They'd gotten the social number. And that was a massive mess. Didn't get the house that he was trying to buy because of the qualifications, and it was just real, real ugly stuff. So enough about the background information. Let's actually start digging into some of the real-world breaches that we've seen there. And the first big one that we always associate with 1386 is ChoicePoint. And I did a bunch of research when I was pulling this together, and I could not find another breach that directly referenced 1386 until 2005 when ChoicePoint occurred. The only potential one, there was a San Diego State University, and it was kind of fluffy. You couldn't really tell if they were doing the notification based on 1386 or anything along those lines. But ChoicePoint's the big one that we're all familiar with. In this case, they detected unusual activity from 50 other small business accounts. And basically what happened was the bad guys went ahead, created 50 fake businesses, and then started downloading full credit reports. Does anybody here really know what ChoicePoint has on you? Has anybody actually seen it? I have. A full, not your credit rating, the full ChoicePoint report. What's in it? Yeah.
I mean, your mortgage, legal judgments, companies you own.
Financial, credit records, credit ratings, insurance history, anything that could possibly be a public or private record that they get their hands on, they have. As a matter of fact, it is so powerful that law enforcement is not allowed to do a ChoicePoint search without special court orders, because it gets into the financial information that they're not allowed to do. I mean, I'm not joking about that. I got a preview from one of ChoicePoint's competitors of a law enforcement system they had, and it was able to calculate out my known associates. And this was the one that they were allowed to do because it was based on the non-financial records, which the law enforcement was allowed to use. And it was a 3D visualization system. I'm not kidding. This exists. I saw it 3 or 4 years ago. 3D visualization system. And they were showing me this with their demo stuff, and I go, hey, I give you guys permission. Run this on me right now. So there was me and the little dot, and then it started out from there. It had my best friends because I've been roommates with them. It had a number of known associates because our employment histories overlapped. It showed my friends' friends because they had been roommates with other friends of ours and such back in college. Just tracking through our credit history to look at where we lived and associate this into a visualized real-time 3D system. Freaking amazing and freaking scary. So, bad stuff. Anyway, ChoicePoint. They detect that fraud activity in 2004. 35,000 California residents were notified, wow, quite a bit later, September to February. Anybody know why? Because a bunch of lawyers were sitting in a room with sweat pouring down their face going, what the fuck do we do now? What do we have to do? I know because I've gotten these calls from people going, what is the legal minimum requirement now that we have suffered a breach? And they sweated it out, and they realized they were going to have to do a notification, and they realized they're going to have to do it for California. Notified 35,000 people. And February 16th, based in large part on leaks from law enforcement, they reveal that, so 8 days later, that the problem isn't limited to California. On the 19th, the day later, 38 states' attorneys general go, what about us? What about our residents? What about our citizens in our states? We demand you notify us or we're not going to make your life very happy. So a couple of days later, ChoicePoint adds additional 110,000 people. Now what's really interesting about this, does anybody know where ChoicePoint came up with that number? And by the way, everything I'm talking about is based on public information. So potentially you guys all know this stuff. What I just try to do is pull it together into an actual case study story. Does anybody know where they came up with that number? Those were the losses that were going back to July 31st, 2003, and they stopped measuring before that, the day 1386 went into effect. So they only went ahead and did their internal analysis, or at least what they were willing to reveal, and only do notifications back to the point where the law, at least in California, went into effect, and they ignored everything before. Law enforcement believed that there were over 500,000 people affected. They traced back 800 cases of identity theft. 800 people, identity theft, not credit card fraud, back to this particular breach. And then in the end, they finally released that 163,000 consumers were officially breached. Anybody think that this might even be a little bit worse than we thought in the beginning? I mean, 800 cases of identity theft. The final, this case didn't end until very recently. This presentation, even though I give it a bunch, I'm constantly updating it. Every conference I re-update it with new information and swap out case studies and stuff. And the final class action lawsuit was settled in January 28, 2008 for $10 million. And if you actually look at the overall losses associated, oops, sometimes I click a little bit too fast on this. If you actually go ahead and look at all the losses that were associated with this, $10 million in an FTC settlement, $2 million in notification costs. So that's $2 million notification costs for, what was it, 163,000 people. So you can actually do the math on what just their pure notification costs were on that particular one. Legal fees and everything else. Now this is where some of the loss numbers you see come from. My former employer, Gartner, said it was about $90 in losses. They actually looked at some of the stock impact that occurred when this incident occurred, although ChoicePoint fully recovered from that loss. But these are the losses they did not fully recover from. I still just stick with the lower cost, but these are all very measurable losses associated with this. Now, in the scheme of things, this probably isn't all that big for a company like ChoicePoint. Although their internal changes that they made, I mean, ChoicePoint is actually, I've heard very good things about their security these days. I mean, they really realized that this would put them out of business. Because when this occurred, very soon after, there were some congressional hearings about their entire industry, as well as around data breaches that we'll get into. So quite a few losses associated with that. And the thing is this had nothing to do with information security. And that's probably, this is the biggest point I'll make during this entire presentation. The rest of the stuff I'm going to talk about is geekier. I'm going to tell you about content monitoring and protection and DLP and ADMP and all the other garbage that I love to talk about.
Is illegitimate use of legitimate authority?
Absolutely. And some interesting things, by the way, we learned. First of all, this was a business decision that they made. They didn't have to issue those kinds of accounts. They also knew that this type of fraud occurred because it happened. There is a quote from the CEO in the Wall Street Journal from, I believe, 2002, basically saying that they'd had around a similar incident that occurred. That same CEO said in public, this is kind of like the Condoleezza Rice, we never imagined they would crash planes into buildings. Pretty much said, we never imagined that this kind of fraud could occur. They suffered this kind of fraud 3 years earlier. It was an outright, blatant lie. No attempt at the truth there, not even, I mean, just full-on deception. They had experienced that level of fraud. And the technical controls, I got a wave of email from every vendor in the data security realm you can imagine telling me how they could have prevented the ChoicePoint. And they couldn't have done a damn thing. ChoicePoint decided to accept this kind of fraud. They knew it was occurring because it had occurred before. They didn't know the scale of it. And what I've heard is they put a new fraud management system in, and that's when they realized exactly how bad it was. And that's when they began the investigation. Anybody have any other info on this one? Or know more about it that you're willing to? I mean, yeah, it was ugly. By the way, the CISO of ChoicePoint was let go fairly soon after this incident, not because it happened on his watch and it was his fault, but because he ran around calling people like big analyst companies, basically blaming the business and saying that this was not a security failure on their part, which is not a really smart thing to do if you want to keep your job.
At RSA, right around the time that happened, I was sitting next to him at one of the meetings, and we had this discussion. He kept saying, "This isn't a security breach." I said, to the people who lost their identities, it is, and they really don't care whether it was a business failure or a technology failure.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I feel bad for him, but
he landed on his feet. He's doing fine.
Yeah. It's still, nobody wants to go through that.
Right.
So the foundation is obviously, for any of what we're going to talk about the rest of the day, has to be your business policy. And if you work for a business that wants to accept these kinds of losses, and I get this a lot. I mean, back when I was an analyst, and even now when I'm kind of on my own, I get a lot of calls from people or emails from people who are frustrated. Kind of the, you know what, the business isn't listening, and this is a really bad problem, and I want to do this, this, and this. And, you know, I'm like, look, number one, work on your communication skills, the stuff that Mike Rothman, pragmatic CSO, get out there, learn how to talk to the business, make your case, put your metrics in place, and everything else. Number two, if you've done all that and they still don't listen, just get another job. Or accept that you're going to be very frustrated in work. And it happens. I've had crappy jobs before, and I either had to leave or, you know, change or accept what was going on. And that's really the case. But our job should be to educate the business properly so that they understand what the risks are and they can make that decision on accepting that risk or not. All right, all that business garbage out of the way, let's talk geek. So when we look at the foundations of data security and what's going to build on all the rest of the technologies we're going to talk about today, there are things I'm not going to talk about. I am not going to talk anymore about business policy. I'm not going to talk about anymore about business process. I'm not going to talk about identity management. One of the reasons is I think we can all accept that to properly protect data, you need to know who's supposed to access it. You need to know who people really are. There's whole hours worth of presentations on identity management that and tons of information that are available out there. And then you also have to have reasonable network and host security. Because as much as I'm the information-centric security dude, me and Hoff running around, the reality is that stuff ain't all there yet. And so you still have to have good network and host security before you can do a lot of the other things that I'm talking about. And the example I gave yesterday is if somebody's sneaking into your house and, you know, rummaging around under your bed looking for your porn stash or your underwear, you know, your cash in your underwear drawer or some other ridiculous stuff like that, you need to be able to close off your house so that those random people on the street can't get in and figure out which of your kids is the one that's really doing it and stealing your money. So what are the top causes of data breaches? Well, this is where we get into some of the statistical problems that we've got, which is that we don't have really good statistics. What we have is public notifications. So breach disclosures is what we have. And breach disclosures, like any other self-reporting criminal statistic, are notoriously inaccurate. There's no way to really correlate those directly to real activity. The example I will give is I was talking to somebody in a financial services industry who they did a notification for a breach. A credit card processor they used had been breached. They notified. They know there were like 3 other financial institutions that used that credit card processor. 2 out of those 3 notified. 1 didn't. Because they didn't think they could get it. I mean, there's no way that that particular company didn't also suffer a breach based on how this particular breach occurred. They didn't do the notification. They were not in compliance with whatever breach notification laws of the, you know, one of the 38 states or whatever it is now that has it. I've lost that. Anybody know the real number anymore? It was like 37 or something, and it's.
Yeah, Massachusetts just had 93H not that long ago. I think it's around 38.
Yeah, it's somewhere around 38 states have breach notification laws right now. There's a lot of threats for national law. And there's some international stuff. Japan has one. Australia is just starting to do one. And hopefully, Australia is actually quite messy with some of these problems right now. So what are the top concerns based on the breach notification laws? And by the way, some of this is also based on my conversations with people and my work as a consultant and as an analyst. Lost and stolen laptops is the biggest source of breach notifications. And if you look at particularly recently at the statistics, there are more incidents associated with that than anything else. Lost and stolen backup tapes, it's actually dropping off a little bit. I'm seeing a lot less about tapes now than we used to be. It's more laptops and tapes these days, in large part because I think there's been some changes within certain parts of the industry. Not even just like, it's not that they're encrypting everything, it's just how they handle those tapes has changed a bit. We have inadvertent disclosures, which is very high on the list. And inadvertent disclosures isn't necessarily the DLP, data loss prevention, you actually sent an email out. A lot of this is actually people posting stuff on their website. Open FTPs, Schwarzenegger did that. He had recorded telephone conversations that you could get to by a directory traversal attack, which was even hard to call a directory traversal attack because it was like some California server and you just added you deleted the slash whatever and you just put the slash down and you could get to the all of the recordings of his particular phone calls. And then direct hacking and compromise, and we'll talk more about that, which I think now is, even though the statistics don't show it, my personal belief is this is the fastest growing area of these particular breaches. In large part, I don't think the statistics fully recognize that because it is much harder to, in many cases, to detect these particular incidents. And I've talked to a lot of institutions who've kind of realized, have kind of been victims of these kinds of things. I think in sheer numbers of lost credit card numbers and everything else, the laptops are way at the top of the list. More often than not, those are being stolen because of the value of the laptop. Even today, it's still mostly the value of the laptop, not the data on it. I think when it's actually these hacking and compromise incidents that more often directly correlate with fraud. We'll go into that. So when we look at laptops and portable media, there were 308 million records lost in 681 incidents. The last time I ran the statistics, which was about a month ago, I didn't have time to update them since then thanks to this shoulder surgery, but that's a fairly big number as it is. And some classic examples, we know there's an MCI laptop. This is one of the earlier ones in 2005. JP Morgan Chase, so now we have a telecom and financial services, two industries we pretend to like to trust. 2006, the IRS, 500 laptops in 3.5 years. That's pretty impressive, actually, to lose that many laptops over that time period. I'm not even, and the FBI, by the way, has lost some. I used to have an FBI number on here, but I thought these were a bit more fun. That was pretty high, too. Ernst & Young, auditor, losing laptops of information of thousands of corporate customers. And here's an example of one of the biggest problems with data breaches, and that's why I throw this one on there. If Ernst & Young lost a laptop with 243,000 Hotel.com customers, so the auditor lost it, guess who had to do the breach notification? Hotels.com. If you collect information from a customer and you've got those records, it doesn't matter who else loses them, you're going to probably be the ones responsible in a breach. And you can go sue E&Y later for it, or whoever your auditor is. Deloitte & Touche, like when they left the CD of over 9,000 McAfee associates in the seat back of the airplane in front of them. Any McAfee people here? I mean, probably in this room. There usually are. I have friends. Amrit Williams, the CTO of BigFix, was commenting on my blog because I was talking about some of this identity theft stuff. And he was a little making fun of it. And I'm like, well, Amrit, you lost your records in this particular incident. It was a contest I was holding to give away some free identity theft protection services somebody sponsored. And he's like, oh, yeah, kind of forgot about that. A lot of these guys lost their info. So the lost laptops, the portable media, we know those are bad. The first big one that we all know about is the VA. And this is a really good case study to dig into exactly how these things occur. They revealed on May 22nd that a laptop and an external hard drive with 26 million records were stolen. Actually, what happened was it was the external hard drive that had all the records, not the laptop. And the worker, the employee, was not only authorized to work with that data, was wink, wink, nod, nod, yeah, take it home, oh, don't worry about that policy, as they later determined during the investigation, took the things home. And he actually was smart. He put I just moved my arm the wrong way, sorry. For those of you who walked in late, I've been walking around with the sling on. I just had surgery. All right, so pain is away enough I can continue. He had the laptop in one part of his house, and he had the hard drive like in another part of his house. And unfortunately, the bad guys took both. Well, this set waves. Remember the two groups you don't want to piss off? VA is one of them. I'm sorry, the veterans are one of them. So they did the big investigation. They found out that just terrible policies and stuff in the VA. It was not, or terrible enforcement of policies within the VA. Wasn't, you know, the employee was culpable with the VA. The management was culpable themselves. And a lot of records, by the way. I mean, on that particular hard drive, it was 26 million records. It was every veteran that had been discharged since 1971, which is a lot. Now, on June 23rd, the government issued OMB M016. Bleh. And basically, this said that all laptops had to be encrypted within 45 days, and that if you ran a big database extract from any of the major databases, that had to be either deleted within 90 days or documented why you still needed to keep that data outside the database for 90 days, and a couple of other things. Anybody here in the government? Maybe not here, but so were you in compliance with?
I'm in the state government.
Oh, federal? Anyone? Now, well, you know, I have yet to find a single federal client that was in compliance with this within the 45 days. Why? Because our current administration puts out lots of little mandates and doesn't give any money for them. Actually, most administrations do this. And so there was no funding provided. Now, what's interesting is 5 days later, they recovered the laptop and the hard drive. The FBI did. Some guy stole it and were trying to eBay it or something along those lines. So there were no records actually lost during this incident. Didn't matter. So the political fallout was big. Heads were rolling on this. Inspector General investigations, new memos out there forcing everybody to change everything, and then we still had another breach a little bit later. So well outside of that 45-day timeline, there was another loss, and there was actually another, I believe they had another loss since then because they still had not encrypted those systems afterwards. And it's not just in our country this happens. We've all heard of the Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs Service over in the UK. They had lost a laptop in like October 2007. This is the tax authority. Then they revealed to Parliament that 41 laptops are lost, been stolen in the last year. And then CD with 15,000 customers from one of the insurance companies got lost. This is all, you know, the warm-up. And then the big act, which was on October 18th, this past October, a junior official mailed 2 CDs with the entire child benefits database. Anybody know what that is? Every single person in the UK who has had a child was in this particular database. All of their insurance records, which included their financial stuff, had mailed that through the mail, and they just kind of don't know where it went. They don't know if the wrong person got their hands on it, or it just got lost in the mail, or if it's sitting in somebody's desk or anything else. They had to do a report to senior management. 25 million Britons were at risk. What's the population, 60 or 80 million? 60, I think? Yeah, so fairly significant percentage. They try to blame the employee for violating policy. Rampant practice in the UK government. Later investigations revealed every freaking agency was mailing these CDs around with this information, and that's how they were doing their data exchange. And you notice a trend: a junior official, an employee with unapproved hard drives or CD-ROMs taking them home. They're always trying to blame somebody else, and in every case the investigations reveal that it was just massive practice and policy failures. And they're having all sorts of political problems over there. Somebody want to tell me why we have such a big problem with laptops and why we have such a big problem with portable media, including CDs? Because they're freaking mobile. It's the definition of mobile devices. It moves. The ability to move or be moved freely or easily. We lose things. Anybody read Stephen Levy's talking today? Anybody read about how he lost his MacBook Air?
Yeah.
It's hilarious. Apple gave him, he's one of like only 4 journalists to get a MacBook Air from Apple themselves, and he thinks he might have thrown it out with his newspaper in the morning. Did you read it the same way? That's the way I read it. He, no joke, literally believes he lost it by throwing it out with the newspaper in the morning. So,
If you actually see one, it feels like a folded over newspaper. It's like that thin and curved.
yeah, it's like, I mean, this I'm going to notice if I lose it, but you know, this I might lose. I probably will lose it someday. That's why I password lock it, even though it's still, you can grab the data off of it. It's not as secure as like a BlackBerry. But yeah, so these things move around freely. So what have we learned over this? Well, you know what? No matter what we do, this stuff's going to get lost. Business policies and telling users that they can't bring stuff or they shouldn't bring stuff aren't going to work, especially because we're probably not going to enforce them anyway. Maybe we in security want to, but their individual managers aren't. And the only thing we can do with this portable media stuff is encryption. I don't know of any other. Does anybody disagree with this?